On Christmas Eve, my daughter-in-law pointed at the hardwood floor in front of 12 dinner guests and threw a mop at me. "Get on your knees, apologize, and clean that up," she snapped. My son didn't move to help me. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "If you want to stay in this house, stop playing the victim and do what you're told." That night, I packed one old suitcase and left without saying a word. Welcome to Grandpa's Revenge. I'm glad you found your way here. If stories like this one speak to you, stay close and follow along, because there are more coming. Quick question before we begin. Are you listening on headphones today, or through a speaker, I ask? Because this story has some quiet moments that carry a lot of weight, and I want it to reach you the right way. A note worth mentioning, some elements of this story have been dramatized for the purpose of storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is coincidental. What matters is the truth underneath it. They believed they'd finally worn me down. What they didn't know was that I'd already found the secret that would unravel everything they'd spent years constructing. A quick note before we begin. This story contains fictional elements woven in for storytelling and reflection. Names and places are coincidental, but the lesson is real. 71 years. That's how long I've been on this earth. I put a wife in the ground, brought a son up on my own, and gave 30 years to crawling through half-built structures in steel-toed boots, hunting for the kinds of flaws and foundations that most men walked right past. When something is close to giving way, I can feel it. What I never anticipated was that the thing I'd watch come apart would be my own family. Christmas Eve, one of those bitter December nights where the lights strung along the roofline seem to promise more warmth than the air has any intention of delivering. Colin and Vanessa's house, a 4-bedroom colonial, tucked inside a gated community on the city's edge, was filled with company. 12 of them, strangers to me, mostly. People from Colin's Furniture Distribution Company, a scattering of Vanessa's contacts from the event planning world, women in cocktail dresses, men in blazers that ran more than my monthly Social Security check. I'd been on my feet since 5 that morning. The living room vacuumed the kitchen floor, done the guest bathroom fixtures rubbed until they threw back the light. Potatoes, peeled vegetables, broken down 2 straight hours, stirring gravy on the stove. When the first guests walked in at 7:00, my lower back was already burning a dull, grinding heat I'd been managing quietly for 2 years and 4 months. I was not a guest in that house. I had never been a guest. Vanessa tracked me down in the hallway sometime around 8:30. The party was loud by then. Wine had been circulating for a while. Arthur, not Dad. It was never Dad, not once in all the time I'd known her. By the Christmas tree, someone dragged in mud. Go handle it. I looked at her. Emerald gown hair, swept up the way you'd wear it to a gala, not a dinner party in her own home. Her face held nothing you could call remorse. Just that flat proprietorial patience, the look you give something that exists to serve a function and isn't doing it. "Vanessa," I said, keeping my voice even, "there's a room full of people in there. And mud on my hardwood," she said, pulling her voice down to something sharp and quiet. "Mop, now." My chest went tight. I thought about the table in there. 12 people, mid-laugh, glasses raised, none of them, knowing that the man who'd handed around the bread, not half an hour ago, was now being dispatched to work the floors like hired staff. But I went. Experience had taught me the cost of not going. The bucket lived beneath the kitchen sink, where Vanessa always kept it. I filled it, worked the water out of the mop head, and brought everything out to the living room. A couple of heads turned. One woman, blonde, somewhere in her mid-40s, seated with her back to the fireplace, held her gaze on me, a beat past comfortable, then returned her attention elsewhere. I worked quietly. The tree caught the light in the corner. Nat King Cole drifted softly from the Bluetooth speaker on the mantel. I focused on the floor. Nearly finished. One more sweep, then back to the kitchen, back to invisibility, the routine I'd long since perfected. I lifted the bucket. I never saw her foot move. Vanessa's heel came out from the far side of the armchair, deliberate, timed, and connected just below my shin. My footing vanished. The bucket lurched forward. My right knee drove into the hardwood, and the water, gray and sudsy, reeking of cheap pine, flew upward in a wide arc and landed square across Vanessa's emerald gown. The room stopped breathing. Every voice, every glass, every sound cut out at once. Vanessa looked down. Then she raised her eyes to mine, and what crossed her face wasn't surprise or fury. It was something she'd been holding ready. Planned. She picked up the mop handle from where it had fallen and threw it at me. It connected with my shoulder. "You did that on purpose." The words hit the room like something thrown hard. You disgusting old man, you did that on purpose. Vanessa, I don't. A finger aimed at me, her expression gone rigid. You kneel down and apologize to me right now, in front of every single person in this room. Or, I promise you my husband will be done with you. Do you understand me? I write the checks in this house. You are nothing here. Nothing. Get on your knees. 12 pairs of eyes. I could feel every one of them, some looking away, some unable to. A woman near the back had her mouth pressed shut in a tight, controlled line. I found my son. Colin had stepped out of the dining room. He filled the doorway broad through the shoulders, dressed up in his new sport coat, red wine in hand. He took in the scene. Me on the floor, his wife across from me. Then he squared himself up and came forward, not to reach down, not to offer his arm, not to speak a word for me. He planted himself beside her. She's right, Dad. The tone was almost indifferent, the voice of someone whose disappointment has long since gone cold. You've been under our roof for years. You want that to continue, act like it. Clean up the mess and tell my wife you're sorry. That's not a request. What came over me right then wasn't grief, and it wasn't anger. Both of those had burned off long ago. It was something quieter, something with more weight to it. A mechanism settling into position after grinding for a very long time. I studied my son's face. I was looking for something specific, the kid I used to drive to Little League, the teenager I'd sat beside through a 103 fever, the young man I'd helped wrestle furniture into his first place. I looked hard. I didn't find any of it. I went down to both knees. The floor was cold and unforgiving. My back sent up a protest I chose to ignore. Somewhere to my rear, a guest murmured something and slipped toward the bathroom. I'm sorry, I said, steady voice. I was deliberate about that. But kneeling there, something settled in my chest, with a finality I recognized. Not grief, not rage. Something older than either, something I'd been holding for 2 years and 4 months, waiting for the right moment to act on. The decision was already behind me. The party cleared out by 10:00. I listened to the front door cycle open and shut again and again. Merry Christmas passed back and forth in the foyer. Chairs scraped. The sounds of an evening breaking up that unmistakable momentum when everyone remembers somewhere they need to be. I sat on the edge of my bed and took it all in through the wall. My room was at the far end of the house, last door, down a tight hallway that had probably been sold to the original buyers as bonus space. Before I arrived, it had stored boxes and shelving. Vanessa had cleared the units out, put a twin bed against the wall, and considered the matter settled. On the ceiling above the window sat a water stain, a pale brown ring the size of a dinner platter that had been there from my second week in. Nobody had ever gotten around to painting it. I got to my feet. The right knee was still tender. I left it alone. From under the bed, I pulled the old suitcase, a navy blue Hartman, the hard shell kind, with a silver latch that the years had stiffened to where it needed real pressure to give. Dolores and I had purchased it in 1958, 2 weeks out from our honeymoon. We carried it to Charleston, South Carolina. 4 nights at a bed and breakfast on Church Street, Spanish moss, draped across every oak, Dolores laughing at small things and nothing things, and somehow making the whole city feel as though it had been arranged specifically for her. I hadn't touched that suitcase since the day we buried her. I'd kept it under that bed for 2 years and 4 months, because putting it away for good felt like a betrayal, and because somewhere in the back of my mind, I had always understood I'd be reaching for it again. I opened the latch. The inside carried a faint smell of cedar and old cotton. I started with the practical things: 2 pairs of slacks, 3 button-downs, underwear, my shaving kit. Then the things that actually mattered. The small frame photo of Dolores from our 31st anniversary, her face lit up, laughing at something I'd said that I can no longer recall, my Bible, the folder of medical records I kept in the nightstand drawer. I moved through it the way I used to work a building inspection, deliberately, systematically, nothing left to chance. Then I crossed to the far corner of the room. The toolbox sat on the floor beside the baseboard heater, a metal case forest green, the kind with a double latch lid and a tray that lifted out to reveal a second compartment beneath. It had occupied that corner since the day I arrived, which meant that for 2 years and 4 months, anyone who glanced at it saw exactly what they expected to see in old man's toolbox: a hammer, some screwdrivers, a level, nothing worth a second look. I opened the lid, lifted out the tray. In the lower compartment, 2 sets of documents. One set was the original sealed inside a waterproof pouch. I drew those out and tucked them into the inner pocket of my winter coat already spread across the bed. The second set careful reproductions printed on aged paper, convincing enough to pass a quick look. I returned to the lower compartment, arranged precisely as the originals had been. I replaced the tray, pressed both latches shut, and nudged the toolbox 6 inches toward the middle of the room where the overhead light would find it more directly. Not enough to look placed, just enough to be noticed. I had been building toward this night for a long time. I hadn't known the exact date, but I had known it was coming. 30 years of reading structures teaches you to recognize the warning signs. The cracks had been visible from the start. I had simply been watching to see how long until the whole thing gave way. I zipped the suitcase, stood it upright, and reached for my phone. Nora picked up on the third ring, her voice thick with sleep. "Art!" A pause, then sharper. "Art, what happened?" My younger sister, 66 years old, retired school teacher, the only living person who had called me Art since our mother passed, had a rare talent for reading what wasn't being said. She didn't need the story, she needed the facts. "I'm leaving tonight," I said. "I need somewhere to stay." A short, hard breath on her end. "Are you hurt? Orb. It burries it is behind a bar." "No." "Are you safe to walk out right now?" "Yes." "Don't move," she said. "I'm coming. 20 minutes. She was gone before I could get another word in. That was Nora. She had driven through a snowstorm to sit beside me in the hospital the night Dolores got her diagnosis. And she hadn't once asked if she was needed. She had simply shown up. I put on my coat. I picked up the suitcase. I took one last look around the room, the stained ceiling, the narrow bed, the single window facing the side fence. I didn't feel nostalgic. What I felt was the particular clarity that used to come at the end of a long inspection, when everything wrong with a structure had been cataloged. The report was finished, and all that remained was to close the folder and walk out. I switched off the lamp. The hallway beyond the door was dark and still. In the living room, the Christmas tree lights were still burning. Someone had forgotten. They blinked on and off, green and gold and red, throwing their colors across the hardwood floor I'd mopped an hour before. I walked past without slowing down. I eased the front door open. The December air came at me immediately, sharp and clean, cold enough to sting the back of my throat. I stepped out. I pulled the door closed behind me gently, carefully, until the latch caught without a sound. No note, no goodbye. I walked to the end of the driveway and stopped. I looked back once the lit windows, the Christmas wreath centered on the door, the whole spotless, polished surface of that life. Then I turned away and started down the sidewalk toward the corner, the old Hartman rolling behind me, its wheels ticking softly against the frozen pavement. Nora didn't ask questions on the way over. She came in her old Buick, still in her robe, pulled over a sweatshirt, climbed out on the curb, and held on to me hard, right there on the sidewalk, without saying a word. On the drive to her place, both hands stayed on the wheel, and her eyes stayed on the road. The only thing she said the whole way was, "You're going to tell me everything when we get there." I said I would. What I didn't tell her, what I hadn't told anyone, was that I had been ready for this night for a very long time, and that the toolbox I had left sitting in that room was not the most valuable thing I had taken out of it. Nora's house smelled of coffee and old paperbacks, the same as it always had, going back to when we were children in Cedarburg, Wisconsin, before either of us had any real sense of what the world could do to a person. She lived on the east side of the city in a 2-story bungalow with a front porch she'd painted green every 3 years for as long as I could remember. I sat at her kitchen table while the Christmas morning light came through the curtains, pale and thin. And for the first time in more than 2 years, no one asked a single thing of me. Nora set a mug of coffee in front of me, black the way I'd always taken it, and pulled the chair out across the table. Still in her robe, silver hair loose around her shoulders, she folded her hands on the tabletop and looked at me the way she used to look at students who were about to say something important, making sure they knew before they started that she was genuinely there. "Start from the beginning," she said. "Not last night, the beginning." So I did. I told her about the first month when things were still civil, when Vanessa would smile at me across the dinner table, and Colin would ask about my day, and I let myself think it might actually work. I told her about the point when the smiling ended. It wasn't a single moment. It was gradual, the way rot moves into a beam invisible until the day you push your thumb against the wood and it goes straight through. She told me I couldn't use the living room, I said. 6 months in. She said it was for guests. Nora's jaw tightened. "You were a guest." I was not a guest. I closed both hands around the mug. I was the man who mopped their floors at 5 in the morning before anyone else was awake. I cooked 4 nights a week. I drove Vanessa's dry cleaning across town because she said the cleaner near their house wasn't up to her standard. I ironed Colin's shirts. My voice snagged on that. Every Sunday night, Nora, I ironed his shirts, the same boy whose shirts I pressed before his first day of high school. Nora's lips came together so hard they went white. And Colin just allowed it. Colin did more than allow it. The ceramic was burning my palms, but I didn't set it down. He was part of it. When I told him something bothered me, he said I was being too sensitive. He told me I ought to be grateful they'd taken me in. I studied the surface of the coffee. He used those exact words to me. Grateful. Nora's voice cracked. He said it in front of her so she'd hear it. I set the mug down with care. That's what I need you to understand, Nori. It wasn't Vanessa on her own. It was both of them. She was the blade. He was the hand that held it. Nora pushed back from the table and went to the window above the sink. Her shoulders were shaking. She gripped the counter edge with both hands and looked out at the backyard, and I could see she was working hard to hold back something she knew she'd regret saying. Why didn't you call me? Her voice was raw. 2 years, Art. Why didn't you pick up the phone? Because I was ashamed. The word fell between us like something heavy dropped from a height. Ashamed that I'd let it go on that long, that I hadn't gone sooner, that I had stood in their kitchen at 5 in the morning, scrubbing their pots, and told myself it was fine. My eyes burned. I blinked it back. A man gives his whole life to building something, a family, a son he can look at with pride. And then he finds himself in a storage room at night, listening to them carry on. In a living room, he's been told he isn't welcome in, asking himself, where did I go wrong? What did I fail to see? Nora turned around. Her eyes were wet, and she made no effort to conceal it. She came back across the kitchen, pulled out her chair, and sat down. Then she reached over the table and put her hand over mine. You didn't miss anything, she said, and there was a fierceness in it. He made his own choices. That belongs to him, not you. I nodded. Then I reached into the inner pocket of my coat draped over the back of my chair and drew out the envelope I had carried from that house. Nora looked at it. What is that? Something I need you to see. I set it on the table between us and opened the flap. Inside was a document, several pages printed from a secure account portal, the letterhead of Dolores' insurance provider across the top. As her named beneficiary, I had kept access to that portal after she passed. I had been logging in quietly for months, looking for something I couldn't quite put a name to. I printed this out 4 months ago, the night it arrived by email, and had been carrying it with me ever since because I hadn't known what to do with what it told me. I turned to the second page and pointed to a single line, a withdrawal record, a date, a dollar amount. Nora leaned in and read it. I watched her face. I watched the moment comprehension arrived, because it didn't come gradually. It came all at once like a switch thrown in a dark room. Who authorized this? Her voice had dropped to nearly nothing. I refolded the document, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it into my coat pocket. My hands were steady. My chest was not. It felt like a fist had closed around my heart and was applying slow, even pressure. I need to make one phone call before I answer that, I said. There's someone I have to bring in before this goes any further. Nora stared at me. Art who authorized that withdrawal? I got up, picked up my phone, and stepped out onto the back porch. The December cold was savage, but I barely registered it. I dialed the number from memory. I had committed it to memory 6 months ago, the same week I first found that document and listened to it ring once, twice. He picked up on the second ring. Mr. Greer, Stuart Claiborne said. I've been expecting your call. Claiborne's office was on the 4th floor of a downtown building that had been standing since 1939, solid brick on the outside, marble on the lobby floor, worn smooth by 60 years of foot traffic, and an elevator that groaned and shuddered on the way up, but always delivered you. He had called the building manager as a personal favor to have the heat and lights running. Christmas Day, and Stuart Claiborne was behind his desk in a pressed shirt and reading glasses, a legal pad open in front of him, like it was an ordinary Tuesday. I had known Claiborne for 11 years. He had handled Dolores' estate after she passed. Before that, he had advised me through a property dispute with a contractor who had tried to cut corners on a retaining wall I'd flagged during an inspection. He was 61 years old, compact and methodical, with a face that gave nothing away across a negotiating table. He was among the most respected elder law attorneys in the state, which meant he spent his career protecting people like me from people like Colin. Nora had wanted to come. I told her to stay home, get some rest, and that I would lay out everything when I returned. She had not taken that well. Claiborne rose when I came through the door, shook my hand and indicated the chair across from his. No condolences, no pleasantries. That was one of the things I had always valued about him. "Let's begin with the land," he said, and opened the first folder. The property was a 6-acre parcel on the north side of the city. My father had acquired it in 1950 for almost nothing, land that had sat quietly in my name for decades while the city crept outward in every direction around it. 3 years ago, still working part-time as a consultant, I had been brought in to advise on the zoning reclassification of that entire corridor. I had seen the development projections. With the trained eye of someone who had spent a career reading structural reports, I had understood precisely what that land was going to be worth. The sale closed on December 21st. Claiborne said, pushing the contract across the desk. $7.4 million, the wire transfer cleared the morning of December 24th. He paused and let that settle. By the time you were seated at that dinner table last night, Mr. Greer, those funds had been sitting in your private account for 14 hours. I looked at the contract. My signature sat at the bottom, dated 3 weeks prior. "Colin has no knowledge of this account?" I asked. "None. It was established 18 months ago at a separate institution, in your name only, with no secondary contacts or authorized users." Claiborne folded his hands. "Combined with your existing savings and investment portfolio, $1.25 million, your total liquid assets as of this morning are $950,000. I had known those numbers for months, but hearing them spoken aloud in that quiet office on Christmas morning, after spending the night before on my knees on someone else's hardwood floor, the contrast was something I had no word for. "Tell me about the note," I said. Claiborne reached for a second folder. Inside was the promissory note, the loan agreement Colin had signed when he and Vanessa purchased their house 4 years ago. I had lent my son $140,000 for the down payment because he had asked, and because I had still believed at that point that the man I had raised was somewhere inside the man he had become. "The standard terms are on the first page," Claiborne said. "Repayment schedule, interest rate, all of it. But page 3 is what matters." He turned to the relevant section and moved the folder across to me. "This is an acceleration clause, specifically a character-based acceleration clause. It states that if the borrower is found to have acted in bad faith toward the lender, or if evidence of deliberate deception or financial manipulation is established, the entire remaining balance becomes due and payable immediately, not over time. Immediately." "And the house is the collateral," I said. "Correct. If the balance is called and cannot be met within the specified window, the title transfers to you." He allowed a pause. "I drafted that language myself, Mr. Greer. 8 months ago, when you first came to me and told me what was happening in that house. 8 months ago, the week I found the camera. It had been a Tuesday afternoon. I had gone to my room to retrieve a book and noticed something. I nearly walked past a small irregularity in the smoke detector mounted near the door. The kind of thing that only registers if you've spent 30 years inspecting structures and training yourself to look at what everyone else ignores. I unscrewed the casing. Behind the original components, a wireless micro-camera lens was facing into the room. "They were recording me," I told Claiborne, leaning forward. "Everything I did in that room, every conversation I had on the phone. I believe the intention was to capture footage of me appearing confused, erratic, or incapable material they could use to support a conservatorship filing." Claiborne nodded. The word carried specific weight under American law, a legal arrangement in which a court appoints someone, in this case Colin, to manage the financial affairs of a person deemed unable to handle them independently. If it had succeeded, Colin would have held legal authority over every dollar I owned. Which is precisely why we had begun building the counter-record. "I left the camera where it was," I said. "I made sure to come across as sharp, deliberate, and fully in command of myself in everything I did in that room. If they were going to record me, I intended to give them footage they couldn't use." Claiborne came close to smiling. "And the toolbox." "Bait," I said. I wanted Colin to find the copies and believe he had something on me. Keep him confident. Keep him careless. Buy us the time we need to finish. Claiborne nodded and reached for a third folder. He set it on the desk without opening it. His expression shifted just slightly in a way I had learned to read across 11 years. "There's one more item," he said. "Last week I received documentation from a compliance contact at your bank. It concerns correspondence addressed to you that appears to have been intercepted before it reached your hands." He rested a hand on the closed folder. I want you to go through this carefully when you're ready, because if it confirms what I believe we are dealing with, something considerably more serious than a conservatorship attempt. I looked at the folder. Something cold moved through my chest. Not fear, but that specific sensation I used to get near the end of a long inspection when I found the final crack and grasped the full scope of what I was looking at. "Show me," I said. Nora was in the kitchen warming up leftover soup when I got back from Claiborne's office. The December sun had already slipped behind the rooftops, and the living room was going dim and golden the way it does on short winter days, when the light quits before you've made peace with losing it. She heard the front door and called out without turning. "How bad?" I dropped my coat over the back of the armchair and lowered myself onto the sofa. My lower back had been making its complaints known since the night before, and the long drive downtown hadn't done it any favors. "That depends on which part you mean." She came out of the kitchen with 2 bowls past me one and settled into the chair across from me. Steam lifted from the surface. She studied my face the way she always had, like she was deciphering something written in very small type. "Start with the worst part," she said. "The worst part is that Colin already found the toolbox." Nora's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. "Already?" "Claiborne got a message from Brenda Cromwell this afternoon." I watched Nora's face for recognition. She lives directly across from Colin's house. Tan colonial 2-car garage always has those solar lights running along the front walk. Her husband Ted worked in commercial real estate until 3 years ago when his company restructured and let him go. I paused. I helped Ted get his insurance policy sorted out after that. It was a complicated situation. He'd missed a filing window and was close to losing his coverage entirely. I knew someone at the agency and made a few calls. Brenda never forgot it. "She has cameras," Nora said. It wasn't a question. She had been to Colin's neighborhood enough times to know the layout. 2 of them, facing the street and the driveway. I set my bowl on the coffee table. "She said Colin was in my room by 9 this morning, less than 7 hours after you left. He went straight for the toolbox, Nora, straight for it." Nora let out a short, sharp breath, not quite a laugh. "He knew exactly what he was after." "He did. Which means he'd had his eye on that room and what might be inside it for considerably longer than last night." The thought settled in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. My own son calculating's planning. Brenda said he photographed everything in the lower compartment, spent about 10 minutes in there, then he called Vanessa in and showed her. And Vanessa took pictures with her phone and forwarded them to someone within the hour. I picked up my phone from the cushion beside me and tilted the screen toward Nora. Colin's messages were still open. I'd been reading through them on the drive back. He started messaging me around noon. Nora leaned forward and read. Her expression moved through several things in rapid succession: disbelief, anger, something that looked almost like grief. She read aloud, her voice pulled tight. "Stop being dramatic and come home. You're embarrassing our family. People are asking questions." She scrolled further. Her nostrils flared. "If you don't respond by tonight, I'm filing a missing person report." She looked up. "Art, he's threatening you." "He's frightened," I said. "There's a difference. A man who actually has leverage doesn't threaten, he moves. Colin is threatening because he doesn't yet know what he's truly holding. He believes those copies in the toolbox are the originals. He thinks he's sitting on something valuable." I took the phone back. Let him think that a while longer. Nora stood and crossed to the window. She pressed one hand flat against the glass and looked out at the darkening street, her breath clouding the cold pane. "Art, I have to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight." She turned around. Her eyes were lit with something fierce and protective that made her look just for a moment precisely like our mother. "How long have you been planning this?" "Not 8 months, not since the camera. How long?" I held her gaze. "Since the night Dolores died," I said. "When I got home from the hospital and found that Colin had already been on the phone with a real estate agent about the house." Nora's face broke for just a second. A flash of raw pain. She pulled back almost immediately. She pressed her fingers to her mouth, drew a slow breath through her nose, and gave one short nod. "All right," she said. Her voice was steadier than her eyes. "All right. So what do we do right now tonight?" I picked up my phone and typed a single message to Colin. "I'm fine. Stop looking." I sent it and turned the screen off. "Right now," I said, "we let him believe he's winning. Claiborne will handle the rest." I reached for my soup. It had gone lukewarm, but I didn't mind. There's one more thing Brenda mentioned, Nori. She said Vanessa was on her phone for a long stretch after Colin showed her the photographs typing something. Brenda couldn't make out what. I looked at the darkened screen in my hand. Whatever it was, I had a feeling we'd find out soon enough. Nora shook me awake 2 mornings later, not gently. She grabbed my shoulder with both hands and pulled the way she used to drag me out of sleep when we were kids, and I'd gone through the alarm. I came up fast, already tense. Art, her voice was clipped. You need to see this right now. It was barely past 9:00. The light through the guest room curtains was thin and flat, that particular gray of late December, in a city that has stopped expecting sun until March. I sat up, and Nora put her phone in my hands. The screen showed a social media post. Vanessa's profile photo occupied the corner, her in a white blazer, professionally lit, the kind of image people choose when they want to project credibility. The post had been up 6 hours, 34,000 views, the number still climbing as I watched. The video was 43 seconds long. I pressed play. Vanessa appeared on screen in what I recognized as their living room, the one I had never been permitted to use. She wore a simple gray cardigan hair, loose, no visible makeup. She had thought this through carefully. She knew exactly the impression she was after. I don't usually share personal things like this, she said to the camera, her voice soft and trembling in a way that set my teeth on edge. But I'm at a loss, and I need some guidance from people who've been through something similar. A practiced pause. My father-in-law has been showing signs of serious cognitive decline for several months. We've tried to address it privately as a family, but 2 nights ago he had a violent episode at our Christmas dinner, and then he left the house without telling anyone where he was going. Her voice broke right on schedule. We don't know where he is. We're scared for his safety. If anyone has experience navigating this kind of situation with an elderly family member, please reach out. The video cut off. I handed the phone back to Nora. My jaw was so tight it ached. There's more, Nora said. She scrolled down to the comments. Most were precisely what Vanessa had engineered them to be: sympathy-shared accounts of difficult elderly relatives, a scattering of recommendations for memory care facilities. But others had found their way in. Nora read one aloud. Wait, isn't this the woman who threw a mop at her father-in-law for Christmas? I was following someone at that dinner. Something doesn't add up here. Good, I said. Let that thread breathe. Art, she's calling you violent and demented on the internet to 34,000 people. I know what she's doing. I got out of bed, found my phone on the nightstand, and called Claiborne. He answered before the second ring, which told me he'd already seen it. I was about to call you, he said. I've downloaded the video and forwarded it to a digital forensics contact. But Mr. Greer, before they even run the analysis, I want you to look at something. Do you remember the gray flannel shirt you're wearing in that footage, the one where you're standing in the kitchen looking disoriented? I thought back. I remember that shirt. I bought it in April. I wore it for the first time on a Tuesday, I recall, because I had a follow-up call with you that afternoon about the land contract. And do you still have it? It's in the suitcase I packed. Why? Claiborne's voice sharpened with something that wasn't quite excitement but was close. Because you have a habit, Mr. Greer. You mentioned it to me once. You said you'd been doing it since your inspection days when you needed to track which gear you'd worn on which job site. You embroider a small date on the inside of the cuff, the month and year you first wore the garment. My heart kicked hard in my chest. He was right. It was such a deeply ingrained habit that I barely registered it anymore. A tiny 2-digit month, 2-digit year, stitched in dark thread on the inside left cuff of every shirt I owned. April. That shirt would read 0425. The video shows me in that shirt, I said, slowly working it through as the words came out. But the scene she was claiming, she was implying it was recent, within the last few months. That particular clip was recorded no earlier than April's of this year, Claiborne said, and his forensics contact believed the full video had been assembled from at least 6 or 7 separate recordings made across different months. The lighting changes. The shadows fall differently. The shirt in one clip is not the shirt in the next. A pause. She stitched a narrative out of fragments, and every fragment is date-stamped literally by your own hand. I let out a slow breath. Nora was watching my face. Her arms were folded tight across her chest, her expression moving between fury and something that was almost close to admiration. What do we do? I asked Claiborne. Nothing public. He said it immediately, no hesitation. You don't post. You don't comment. You don't have Nora speak for you. Every word you put into the public record becomes material for whatever she files next, and she will file something next. Let her keep talking. The more she commits to a version of events, the more we have to dismantle. Another pause. Also, Mr. Greer, she filed something at the courthouse this morning. I received the notification just now. I need you to come in tomorrow. The atmosphere in the room shifted, heavier somehow. What did she file? I asked. Come in tomorrow, Claiborne said. And bring Nora. She should be there for this. He was gone before I could press him. I set the phone down and looked at Nora, who had caught enough of the exchange to know something had changed. Tomorrow, I told her. Claiborne's office. He'll walk us through it. Nora pressed her palm flat against her sternum, like she was trying to hold something together inside. Art, I swear to God, if that woman has done what I think she's done, she has, I said. But so have we, and ours is going to hold up a great deal better in a courtroom. Conservatorship. The word arrived the way bad news always does not like a thunderclap, but as a slow-building pressure behind the breastbone, the kind that takes a moment to land and then refuses to leave. Claiborne said it from across his desk on the morning of December 28th, and I watched his face carefully as he did, because Claiborne's face was the most reliable instrument I had ever encountered. When something was merely complicated, his expression stayed even. When something was genuinely dangerous, a small vertical crease appeared between his eyebrows. It was there now. Colin filed the petition this morning, he said, sliding the document across the desk toward me. Technically, the filing is in his name. He's the petitioner of record. Under California law, only a close family member or interested party can initiate conservatorship proceedings. A daughter-in-law doesn't qualify on her own. He paused. But the language in this petition, Mr. Greer, the phrasing, the structure, the way the medical concerns have been framed, this was not written by Colin. This was written by someone who knows precisely which language draws a court's attention. I picked up the document. The paper felt heavier than it had any right to. I read the opening paragraph, and my stomach turned not from fear, but from a cold, sharpening anger, the kind that doesn't make you want to raise your voice, but makes you go very, very still. The petition described me as exhibiting progressive cognitive deterioration, unpredictable emotional outbursts, and an inability to manage my personal financial affairs without outside supervision. It cited the Christmas dinner incident as evidence of violent behavior. It requested that Colin be appointed conservator of my estate, meaning he would hold full legal authority over every account, every asset, every financial decision I made for as long as the court saw fit. $950,000 under my son's control. She wants to reach it through him, I said. That's my read, Claiborne said. Colin gets the legal standing. Vanessa gets access through the marriage. He leaned forward, hands flat on the desk. Mr. Greer, I want to be direct with you. If this petition reaches a full hearing without a strong counter-record, there is a real risk. Courts take elder welfare seriously, as they should, but that also means they can move quickly when what's in front of them looks like compelling evidence of decline. The video, I said. The video testimony from people who were at that dinner and whatever else they've been assembling. Claiborne's jaw tightened barely perceptibly. We need to place you in front of an independent evaluator without delay. A court-appointed neuropsychologist with no connection to either side. You take the evaluation you perform, which I have no doubt whatsoever you will, and we attach those results to our counter-filing. Something lifted in my chest. Not quite relief. Readiness. The feeling I used to get at the start of a particularly complex inspection, a large building, hidden problems, and nothing to do but lace your boots and begin. Schedule it, I said. The sooner the better. Claiborne nodded and wrote it down. There's also the matter of Jeffrey Ashton. He glanced up. Ashton is the attorney Colin retained to handle the conservatorship filing. 30 years in family and estate law. Competent, well-regarded, not someone who takes on cases he believes he'll lose. A pause. He called my office yesterday afternoon. Said he wanted to, and I'm quoting, get a sense of the landscape before things accelerate. That is not language a confident attorney uses. I let that sit for a moment. He's already having doubts. He's asking questions, Claiborne said carefully, which tells me something his client told him isn't squaring up. I didn't give him anything. I simply told him we'd be filing a formal response within 72 hours. But Mr. Greer, a defense attorney who begins questioning his own client, is a very useful presence to have in the picture. Nora, who had been sitting in the chair beside me, with her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white, spoke at last. "Can they actually win this?" Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with something close to fury. "Honestly, can they?" Claiborne looked at her directly. "Not if we move correctly. The video evidence is their strongest card, and we already have grounds to believe it's fabricated. The Christmas dinner incident, which they're framing as violent behavior, is contradicted by the accounts of every guest who was present, most of whom will have no desire to be attached to a false legal filing." He turned back to me. "And then there's the evaluation itself. Mr. Greer, what is your educational background?" "Bachelor's in Civil Engineering," I said. 31 years as a licensed building inspector. 8 years on the State Structural Advisory Board." Claiborne wrote it down with the quiet efficiency of a man adding rounds to a magazine. "And your current cognitive state in your own assessment?" I almost smiled. "I've been managing 9-figure land transactions and counter-surveillance operations for the past 8 months. My cognitive state is fine." Nora released a breath that was halfway to a laugh. Claiborne permitted himself a brief, dry expression, the closest thing to humor I had witnessed from him in 11 years. "One more item," he said, his manner turning serious again. He reached for a separate folder, thinner than the others, labeled with Denise Hartley's name in his precise handwriting. "I received preliminary contact from a compliance officer at your bank. Her name is Denise Hartley. She handles regulatory compliance. Her role is to flag transactions and communications that fall outside normal parameters." He opened the folder. "She's found something in the mail correspondence records that she believes requires your direct attention. I've arranged for us to meet with her on the 30th. He looked at me over the rims of his reading glasses. "I don't want to characterize what she's found before she can present it properly. But Mr. Greer, I want you to be ready. What she's uncovered may escalate this situation considerably." My hands rested perfectly still on the arms of the chair. My chest was another matter. "How considerably?" I asked. Claiborne closed the folder. "The kind that involves federal statutes," he said. "Get some rest this weekend, and bring Nora on Tuesday." The bank conference room was on the 2nd floor, a rectangular space with a long, oval table chairs that cost more than most people's sofas and windows that looked out over the parking structure next door. Not the sort of view intended to put anyone at ease. Denise Hartley was already there when Claiborne and I arrived, standing at the head of the table with a folder in front of her, and the composed, watchful expression of someone who had delivered difficult information many times before and had long since mastered the art of doing it without flinching. She was younger than I'd anticipated, mid-30s, dark hair drawn back in a tight bun, a charcoal blazer over a white blouse. When Claiborne introduced us, she extended her hand. "Mr. Greer." Her grip was firm. "Thank you for making the time. I know the circumstances aren't easy." "Tell me what you found," I said. I settled into the chair across from her. Claiborne took the seat to my left. I hadn't slept well the night before, not from dread, but from that particular restlessness that arrives when you sense something significant is approaching, and your mind won't stop turning it over. Denise opened her folder and arranged 3 documents side by side on the table, all facing me. Over the past 10 months, she began, her voice measured and unhurried. "The bank has sent a total of 14 pieces of correspondence to the address on file for your account, which is the house where your son lives. Standard account notices, 1 investment maturity alert, 2 account activity statements, and 3 letters concerning a trust instrument that required a signed response from you." She indicated the first document, a printed log of outgoing mail with dates and delivery confirmations. "Of those 14 pieces," she continued, "not a single one generated a reply from you. That's unusual. The trust letters especially, those require a signed return within 60 days. When no responses came, we sent follow-up notices. Those also went unanswered." She paused. "That's what opened my review." Something cold began moving through my chest. I kept my face even and my hands flat on the table. "The Postal Service provides delivery confirmation on certified mail." Denise went on, sliding the second document toward me. "These are the delivery records. Every certified letter was signed for. The signatures are on file." She pointed to the signature line on each record. "Mr. Greer, can you tell me whether any of those are yours?" "Wendy, ambibostawayasi story D." I studied them. Someone had practiced, the resemblance was close, but they weren't mine. My signature carried a particular upward hook on the capital H, something I'd developed in my 20s and never altered. Every signature on those records flattened the H into something generic and unremarkable. None of them, I said. My voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. Denise nodded as though she'd anticipated that answer. We pulled security footage from the postal branch nearest your son's address. The footage covers a 12-month window. She reached into the folder and produced a printed screenshot, grainy, time-stamped, but sufficiently clear. A woman standing at the counter signing a clipboard. Her face was angled partly toward the camera. I recognized the posture before the face registered. Vanessa. She intercepted the mail, I said. It wasn't a question. That's what the evidence indicates, Denise said. She had signed for correspondence addressed to me without my knowledge or authorization on at least 6 separate occasions. She folded her hands on the table. Mr. Greer, I want to be unambiguous about something. Intercepting mail addressed to another person and deliberately preventing it from reaching them is a violation of federal law, specifically Title 18 of the United States Code. Section 1341, the Federal Mail Fraud Statute. It carries a maximum sentence of 20 years per count. Nora, who had been sitting rigid beside me with her hands pressed together in her lap, made a sound low in her throat, not quite a word, not quite a gasp. 20 years, she said, her voice barely a breath. Per count, Claiborne said quietly, and we're looking at a minimum of 6 documented instances. I sat staring at that screenshot, Vanessa, at the postal counter. Something was moving through my chest that I couldn't name precisely. It wasn't satisfaction, and it wasn't grief. It was the sensation of a structure finally disclosing its full damage, like a building you've spent months examining from the outside, tapping walls, reading the surface, and you've finally opened the right panel and seen the rot that runs all the way to the core. She was hiding account notifications, I said, working it through aloud. If I never saw the investment maturity alert, I had no reason to follow up, no reason to reach out to Claiborne about the trust. She was keeping me financially blind while she and Colin worked out how to get at what was mine. That's consistent with the pattern, Denise confirmed. The timing of the interceptions also aligns with the period during which the conservatorship plan appears to have been taking shape. She paused, then reached for the third document, a single printed sheet, which she placed face down on the table in front of her. There's one more item. I debated including it because it falls somewhat outside the scope of my compliance review, but I believe you need to see it. She looked at me directly. It involves a separate account, not yours, but one connected to your family. I came across it during a routine cross-reference. She didn't turn the page over yet. She was watching me the way a doctor watches a patient before a result comes back reading, whether the person across from them is prepared. Show me, I said. She turned the page over and slid it across the table. I looked at the numbers. I looked at the account name. I looked at the transaction date. My hands didn't shake. I had decided they wouldn't, but something behind my ribs did something. I felt all the way up into my throat a slow, terrible tightening, like a knot being drawn closed around something I had been carrying for 3 years, without ever knowing its full weight. I understood in that moment why Claiborne had told me to bring Nora. This was no longer just about intercepted mail. This wasn't only about me. This was about Dolores, and the worst of it hadn't been spoken aloud yet. Claiborne drove me back to Nora's that evening. Neither of us said much on the way. The city was doing what it does in that hollow stretch between Christmas and New Year, half empty half. Lit the streets carrying that particular quiet that settles when most people have gone somewhere else, and the ones who stayed aren't quite sure what to do with themselves. I sat in the passenger seat with the folded sheet from Denise in my coat pocket and tried to arrange my thoughts into something I could manage. I couldn't. Nora was at the kitchen table when we came in a cup of tea in front of her that had long since gone cold. She looked at my face, then at Claiborne's, and whatever she read there made her push her chair back and stand. "Sit down, Nora," I said. My voice came out rougher than I meant it to. "Both of you sit down." I pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the one I'd been using since I arrived at the one closest to the window. I took the sheet from my pocket and laid it flat on the table between us. Nora looked at it, then she looked at me. "Art, what is this?" "That," I said, "is a transaction record from Dolores's medical insurance account, a health benefit fund she had been paying into for 22 years. I pressed my finger to the line that had stopped my heart in that conference room. This withdrawal was processed 14 months before she died. The full balance of her treatment fund, $67,000, transferred to a private investment account in a single transaction. Claiborne sat very still across from me. He had already seen the document. He was watching Nora. Nora leaned closer to the page. I watched the moment the number landed, watched her eyes move across to the authorization line, where the name of the person who had approved the transfer was printed in clean administrative type. Her hand flew to her mouth. She made a sound I had never heard from her before, a high broken thing that she cut off immediately by pressing her fingers hard against her lips. "No," she whispered through her hand. "No, Art. The investment account the money was transferred to," I said, and my voice was doing something strange now, going flat and deliberate, the way it did when I was trying to hold something very large, very still. Was a real estate development fund. It collapsed 4 months later. What you're about to hear is the moment everything I had quietly suspected finally had a name and a number attached to it. The kind of discovery that changes how you understand everything that came before. Before we get there, if you ever learned that someone close to you had been working against you in secret, would you confront them directly, or would you gather every piece of proof first and let the truth do the talking? Total loss. I let the words sit there a moment. Dolores had no idea the transfer had occurred. As far as she knew, her coverage was in place. Then her oncologist mapped out the treatment protocol. The billing office ran the verification, and the account came back empty. $67,000. Gone. The treatments never happened. Nora came apart. Both hands flew to her face, and her whole frame shook with a sob so raw, it seemed to take up the entire room. The kind of crying that only happens when someone has been clenching something for years, and the last bit of resistance finally gives. I stretched my arm across the table and laid my hand over hers. My eyes stung until the room blurred at the edges. I didn't allow it. Not here. Later, maybe in some dark, quiet hour, I'd deal with my half of it. For now, I had to hold steady. "The cancer wasn't what killed her chances," I said. "It was the money being gone that did that. The fund meant to pay for her care had already been emptied." The words caught somewhere in my chest as I said them. She went to her grave thinking the insurance had let her down. She never learned it was our own son who stripped it out from under her. Claiborne's voice came from across the table, low and careful. "Arthur, I'm sorry, truly." I gave a single nod. My hand stayed over Nora's until her breath came back to something even longer than I would have guessed it would take. When she raised her head at last, her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, her cheeks streaked, and she didn't touch them. "He let her die," Nora said. The grief in her voice had burned down to something else, something with an edge. "He stood by and let his own mother die over $67,000 he was going to throw into a real estate deal." "Yes," I said, "and the deal failed. He lost every cent regardless." "Yes." Nora drove her fists against the tabletop and fixed her gaze on the wall. I could see the muscles working in her jaw, the particular look of someone trying to contain two enormous things, at once sorrow and fury, while also absorbing the knowledge that the darkest version of what they feared about a person turned out to be an underestimate. Claiborne gave his throat a quiet clearing. "Arthur, there's a question I have to put to you now, and I want you to sit with it before you answer." He held my eyes. "Everything we've assembled, everything we've set in motion, do you want to see it through? All the way?" I looked at the document still spread on the table between us. I saw Dolores in that hospital room, propped up against the pillows, confused about why the treatments had gone quiet, still certain that someone would straighten it out. I remembered what she'd said last, that she was sorry for being such trouble. Dolores, who in 70 years had never once been trouble to a single living soul. Something settled in my chest right then. Solid. Irrevocable. "Stuart," I said. "All of it. Push it forward. Tonight, if that's possible." Claiborne reached into his briefcase and drew out his legal pad. "Then we go to the next phase," he said. "But you should understand, Arthur, the moment we cross into this, there's no retreating. Colin will see us coming." I turned to look at Dolores's photograph. On Nora's mantelpiece, the anniversary shot from 31 years ago, her face open with laughter at something I'd said. I've long since forgotten what. It didn't matter. The good and blessed, let him. The court-appointed evaluation was set for January 2nd. I know what that sounds like. The new year had barely drawn its first breath. Half the city was still sleeping off the holiday, and there I was pressing my suit and pointing the car toward a psychologist's office on the far side of downtown to demonstrate that my faculties were sound. But I'd asked for the earliest slot available, and Claiborne had applied pressure to secure it. Every day that petition went unanswered was another day Vanessa's carefully constructed story had room to harden. I was there 12 minutes before the hour. Dr. Nance's office occupied a floor of a medical building on the north end of downtown, a space that was clean and deliberately neutral, engineered to feel neither reassuring nor intimidating. Gray chairs in a waiting area, a low table carrying magazines chosen by someone who had never watched anyone actually read one. The receptionist offered water with a practiced smile. I asked for coffee. She produced it without making anything of the substitution. At 9:00 exactly, the evaluator appeared, Dr. Ellsworth Nance. His handshake was confident without any theater to it, and his eyes moved over me the way a skilled clinician's do, gathering data quietly, giving none back. "Mr. Greer," he said, stepping aside, "please come in." The inner office was well-ordered shelves, a desk, 2 chairs arranged to face each other with nothing in between, no desk as a barrier. I noticed that, and I thought well of it. It signaled a man interested in what you actually said, not in maintaining a position of authority while you said it. "Before anything else," Dr. Nance said, settling back and laying a folder across his knee, "I want to establish what this is. The court placed me here as an independent assessor. I have no prior contact with anyone involved in this matter, and whatever I conclude goes straight to the judge. My purpose is not to serve your interests or theirs. It's to determine what's true." He looked up from the folder. "Are you comfortable proceeding on those terms?" "Yet those are exactly the terms I'd choose," I said. The corner of his mouth moved. "Good. Start from the beginning, your professional background." So, I walked him through it. 31 years carrying a building inspector's license. The early stretch of it out on rain-soaked job sites, learning to read a structure the way other people read text. The middle years, when the instinct for what was wrong deepened into something almost automatic. The stretch on the state advisory board, where we wrote the standards that set the floor for everyone working beneath us. The consulting engagement after I retired, including a zoning project on the North Corridor 3 years back. I gave him dates, project names, specific figures, not because I was performing competence, but because precision was simply how I'd always discussed my work. Dr. Nance kept pace with his pen. The questions he slipped in between my answers looked straightforward, but weren't. They were calibrated to distinguish a person recounting memorized material from one who was actually reasoning on the spot. I gave him the real-time version each time. Then the register shifted. "Mr. Greer," he said, his tone remaining even. "A video submission is part of the petition record. I reviewed it during my preparation. It shows you in what appears to be a home environment, and the petitioner frames your behavior in it as confused and erratic. I'd like your account of that footage." I angled forward slightly in my chair. "Before I give you one, Dr. Nance, in the kitchen clip, do you recall what shirt I have on the gray flannel?" He turned back through his notes. "I can pull up the stills. Yes. The inside of the left cuff," I said. "I stitch a date on every shirt, month and year, the first time I wear it. That one reads April of last year." I watched his pen go still, which puts the recording date no earlier than April. The petitioner is presenting this as evidence of a current decline, grounds for an emergency filing in December. But that clip is at minimum 8 months old, shot in an entirely different set of circumstances. Dr. Nance lifted his eyes from the page. Something in his face shifted, not quite surprise, but the particular expression of a man revising an assumption. "That's a claim that can be checked," he said. "It can," I said. "The shirt is available. Claiborne is holding it." He wrote without speaking for a full 30 seconds. Then the pen went down, and he looked at me squarely, the clinical distance gone. "Mr. Greer, today's date, the sitting president, and a rough figure for a 30-year fixed mortgage at the current rate." I gave him all 3 without a pause. He read me a 7-number sequence and asked for it backward. I gave it back to him. He asked me to draw the distinction between a revocable and an irrevocable trust in plain terms. 2 sentences covered it. He closed the folder. "Mr. Greer, thank you." He rose and put out his hand. The grip hadn't changed from the start of the session, but the look behind his eyes had. That ranks among the clearest evaluations I've conducted this quarter. Claiborne was in the lobby when I came through, still in his overcoat, a coffee cup cradled in one hand. He read whatever was on my face and let out a slow breath through his nose. "That well?" he said. Better," I said. We pushed out through the doors into the January cold side by side. My phone pulsed in my pocket. Something coming in that I didn't stop to check. Claiborne caught the door on the swing and mentioned it the way he always mentioned things that mattered, dropping it into the air like it was incidental. "Jeffrey Ashton rang the office while you were in there. He asked one question." A pause. He wanted to know whether criminal charges were something you intended to pursue or whether there was still space for a conversation. I stopped walking. The cold air pressed against my face, and I let it do that for a moment. "What does that tell you?" I asked. Claiborne held my gaze. "It tells me," he said, "that someone on their side has finally understood what they've walked into." Jeffrey Ashton came through the door of Claiborne's office on the morning of January 5th, carrying himself like a man who had spent the better part of 72 hours arriving at a decision he knew he couldn't walk back. Mid-50s, broad through the chest, with a face that had probably read as commanding at one point, and now mostly read as worn. His suit was well cut, but his tie sat crooked, and the way he held his shoulders pushed forward, jaw set, told me he hadn't had much sleep. He had filed a motion to withdraw from Colin's case 3 hours before our meeting. Claiborne had the notification in hand before Ashton ever set foot in the room. Ashton lowered himself into the chair across from Claiborne's desk without waiting to be invited. He set a leather briefcase on his knee, worked the latches open, and placed a small digital recorder on the desk between us. "Before I say anything else," he said, his voice tight and deliberate, "I need to establish that whatever I share here will be considered against the fact of my cooperation. I had no knowledge when I accepted this case that my client intended to use my office as an instrument of fraud. I want that understood and on record." Claiborne looked at the recorder, then at Ashton. "That's a matter for the district attorney's office," he said. "What I can tell you is that voluntary disclosure made in good faith and ahead of any formal charges tends to be received well. I'd advise having your own counsel present for any binding agreement. But you came here today, Mr. Ashton. I'd like to know why." Ashton's jaw shifted. Then he reached back into the briefcase and brought out a second recorder, older, a handheld Olympus, the kind that belonged to an era before everything became a phone, and set it alongside the first. "3 weeks ago," he said, "Colin Greer asked me to alter the execution date on a power of attorney document. He wanted it moved back by 14 months, which would have made it appear that you—" He looked at me directly, for the first time since sitting down, "had granted him authority over your financial affairs well in advance of the land sale closing." His voice tightened. Had that document been filed as genuine, it would have given him a legal basis to claim a portion of the sale proceeds, potentially the entirety. The atmosphere in the room changed. I felt it the way you feel a shift in air pressure before a storm. "He wanted it to look as though I'd signed control of my accounts over to him," I said slowly, "before the land sold." "Yes." Ashton pressed his lips together. "I told him I wouldn't do it, that what he was describing was document fraud, a felony. He told me I didn't have the full picture. Then he told me that if I couldn't find a way to make it work, he'd file a bar complaint against me for malpractice." Ashton's voice went flat. That was when I began recording. He leaned forward and pressed play on the Olympus. Colin's voice filled the office. I had not heard my son speak in 11 days. Coming through a recorder, it sounded altered, sharper, stripped of whatever warmth I remembered, back when there had been warmth to strip. He was speaking fast. His words clipped and pressured the cadence of someone who has convinced himself he's running out of runway. "I'm not asking you to fabricate anything, Jeffrey. I'm asking you to correct an administrative error. The date was always meant to be earlier. Dad was confused when he signed. That's the whole point of the conservatorship. We're just aligning the paperwork with the reality of the situation." Then Ashton's recorded voice, "Colin changing an execution date on a signed legal document is not correcting an administrative error. It is fraud, Colin. Then find another word for it and get it done. Or I will make sure the Bar Association hears about every corner you've ever cut in 30 years of practice." Claiborne reached over and stopped the playback. His expression hadn't moved, but the crease between his eyebrows had deepened to something I'd never seen there before. "I'll need the original recording," he said to Ashton, "and a sworn statement covering the full context." "I have both ready." Ashton reached into the briefcase a third time. His hands weren't entirely steady. I noticed he was gripping the folders harder than the task required, the way a person grips something when the alternative is letting themselves shake. "I wanted on record that I came here before any subpoena, before any formal investigation. I came because what he asked me to do was wrong, and because 3 decades in this profession still means something to me, even when it apparently means nothing to him." Something shifted in my chest at that. Not sympathy exactly, recognition. The look of a man trying to hold on to the last part of himself he hadn't yet lost. "I appreciate that, Mr. Ashton," I said. He looked across at me. The skin at the corners of his eyes was red, scoured with exhaustion, and something that was probably shame. "Mr. Greer, I owe you an apology. I accepted a case I should have looked at far more carefully. I'm sorry for whatever part I played, however unwilling in what's been done to you." I nodded once. It was all I had to give him right then. After Ashton left Claiborne walking him out with the recordings and the sworn statement already on the phone with the district attorney's liaison, before they reached the hallway, I sat alone in the office for a few minutes. My phone buzzed. A message from Claiborne sent from just outside the door. Brenda Cromwell confirmed. Full footage from Christmas Eve. Ready to sign a witness statement whenever we need her. I read it twice. Then I slipped the phone back into my pocket and turned to look out through Claiborne's window at the January sky, old pewter flat, entirely indifferent to everything unfolding beneath it. 8 months of preparation. 11 days since I'd walked out of that house. And now, an attorney who had turned on his own client, a neighbor who had been watching from across the street, and a recording of my son instructing another man to commit a felony on his behalf. I thought about what Claiborne had said as we left the evaluator's office. Someone on their side has finally understood what they've walked into. What I hadn't said then, and what I now understood fully, was this Colin had never grasped what he was walking into. Not from the start, because from the start he had never truly understood his father. He was about to. I had rented the apartment 6 days after leaving Colin's house, a 7th-floor unit in a building on Founders Boulevard downtown. 2 rooms, good light, and a view of the river that reminded me on clear mornings of the view from the back porch of the house Dolores and I had owned before everything changed. I furnished it plainly: a desk, 2 chairs, a coffee maker, a lamp. Dolores's photograph on the windowsill where the morning light could find it. It was the first space that had been entirely mine in over 2 years. Every time I turned the key in the lock, I felt something settle quietly in my chest, the sensation of a structure finding its footing after the ground has shifted beneath it. On the afternoon of January 8th, Colin and Vanessa came to see it for the first time. They arrived together 4 minutes past 3. I watched them come along the hallway through the peephole before I opened the door. Colin, in a dark jacket, no tie his face, carrying 10 days of visible strain. He'd lost weight. The skin under his eyes had gone the color of old bruising. Vanessa walked half a step behind him. That was new. She wore a plain black coat, her hair down, no jewelry I could make out. She had made considered choices about how to present herself today. I noticed that. Claiborne was already inside, settled at the desk in the corner, with a legal pad open and a pen in his hand. A notary public Rosalind, a compact silver-haired woman Claiborne used regularly, sat beside him, her seal and stamp arranged on the table in front of her. Colin stepped into the apartment and took in his surroundings. Something moved across his face when he registered how I was living. Clean-ordered, dignified nothing, remotely like the storage room at the end of the hall. He compressed it quickly into an expression of measured neutrality. "Dad." His voice broke slightly on the word. He cleared his throat. "You look well." "Sit down, Colin," I said. They sat together in the 2 chairs I'd placed facing the desk. Vanessa folded her hands in her lap and held her posture very straight, the way a person does when they are working hard to appear calm and are nowhere close to it. She glanced at Claiborne, then at Rosalind, then back at me. "Who are they?" she asked. "My attorney and a notary public," I said. "This is a legal proceeding. Everything said in this room will be properly documented." Something flickered across Vanessa's face, calculation unease, before she pulled it back under control. Colin didn't react. He was looking at his hands. "Vanessa," I said, "you wanted to say something." She looked up, drew a breath, and then delivered the apology she had obviously rehearsed, measured contrite landing on all the right notes. Sorry for Christmas dinner. Sorry for the way things had unraveled. Sorry for the pain it had caused. Her voice caught in exactly the right places. Her eyes went slightly wet on cue. It was a well-executed performance. If I hadn't spent 71 years learning to tell a load-bearing wall from one that only looks like it, I might have taken it at face value. Colin went next. His apology was shorter and less polished, and that roughness was what gave it weight. His voice broke once genuinely on the word sorry, and he pressed his fist briefly against his mouth before going on. I watched him. I filed it away. "We're in serious trouble, Dad," he said when he had finished. "The bank is threatening foreclosure. We have 60 days, maybe less." He looked up at me, and behind his eyes, I saw the same thing I'd seen on that Christmas Eve floor: desperation, with nothing solid beneath it. I know you don't owe us anything. I know that. But there's nowhere else for us to turn. I let that sit for a moment. Then I got up, walked to the desk, and retrieved the document Claiborne had drawn up. I'm going to help you, I said, but on my terms. These are not negotiable. I set it on the coffee table in front of them. 3 pages the loan agreement across the first 2, the financial declaration on the third. I had read it often enough to recite it. Colin picked it up. Vanessa leaned in beside him. The loan amount is $225, I said, structured as a formal promissory note, the same instrument you signed when I helped with your down payment 4 years ago. Repayment terms, interest rate, and collateral provisions are on page 2. Colin was working through page 1. Vanessa was moving faster. I watched her eyes travel down the page with the quick scanning efficiency of someone hunting for the trap. Page 3, I said, is a sworn financial declaration. Before any funds move, I need both of you to certify under oath that you have fully disclosed every asset account and financial obligation. No undisclosed savings. No accounts held under other names or entities. Nothing hidden. I kept my voice level, the same tone I'd used reading inspection findings aloud at City Hall years ago. Just the facts plainly stated, nothing added. Rosalind will notarize your signatures. This declaration carries the same legal force as sworn courtroom testimony. Vanessa's eyes stopped moving. She looked up at me. For just a fraction of a second, something shifted in her face, a hairline fracture in the composed surface. Then she looked back at the page. This seems very formal, she said carefully, for a family arrangement. It is formal, I agreed. Because I'm not treating this as a family arrangement. I'm treating it as a legal transaction with proper documentation, because that is the only kind of arrangement I'm willing to enter into with either of you going forward. Colin set the document down. He dragged both hands across his face, a gesture so drained, so stripped of any theater, that for a moment I caught a glimpse of the boy I had raised somewhere beneath everything he had become. I'll sign it, he said. His voice was hollow. Vanessa picked up the pen first. She signed each page with the smooth, unhesitating stroke of someone who had weighed the odds and decided they were acceptable. Colin signed below her. Rosalind leaned forward, verified their identities, and pressed her seal onto the declaration page with a firm, conclusive stamp. Claiborne gathered the documents. I moved to the desk, opened my laptop, and initiated the wire transfer, $225,000 from my account to Colin's, exactly as I had said. The funds will clear by Friday, I said. Colin looked at the screen. His throat worked. Thank you, he said, and the words came out like something being put down after a very long carry. Vanessa stood and began buttoning her coat. As she turned toward the door, she let her gaze move around the apartment one final time. The clean walls, the sparse furniture, Dolores's photograph in the window light. Her expression gave nothing away, but her eyes lingered on the door, a half-second too long, the way someone's eyes do when they are already working out what comes next. After they left, Claiborne set his legal pad on the desk and studied the signed declaration for a long moment. The transfer goes Friday, he said quietly. The motion to freeze the title goes Monday. And this declaration, he picked it up and held it with both hands the way you handle something that is simultaneously fragile and charged. The moment we can prove a single line on this page is false, he said, every dollar of that loan becomes due in full immediately. No grace period, no room to negotiate. He set it down. Somewhere across town, Mr. Greer Vanessa is celebrating right now. I'd like to give her the weekend. I looked at Dolores's photograph in the window. The light had moved while we talked, gone from gold to gray, the way January afternoon light does when it runs out. Give her the weekend, I said. Monday is soon enough. The money went out Friday morning exactly as I'd promised. $25,000 cleared and confirmed by 10:00 a.m. By the time I sat down across from Claiborne in his office that afternoon, Colin had already sent a text, 3 words, no punctuation. Thank you, Dad. I read it once and placed the phone face down on the desk. The motion to freeze the title was filed this morning, Claiborne said, drawing a folder from the stack at his left. The court granted it inside 4 hours. As of 11:47 a.m., today Colin cannot sell refinance transfer or place any encumbrance on that property without a court order. He opened the folder in front of me. He doesn't know yet. The notification goes to his address of record, which, as we know, may or may not actually reach him. Something settled in my chest. The particular satisfaction of watching a well-constructed structure bear its load exactly as it was designed to do. When will he find out? I asked. When he tries to do something with the house and finds he can't, Claiborne said. Could be tomorrow, could be next week. Either way, by then, it won't matter. He tapped his pen once against the legal pad. There's something else. Denise Hartley called this morning before the market opened. She's found something new. My spine straightened. What kind of something? Claiborne picked up his phone, put it on speaker, and dialed. Denise answered on the second ring, and I could hear in her voice that she'd been waiting for the call. Mr. Greer, she said. Thank you for making time. I'll get straight to it. The sound of papers shifting. During my cross-reference review of the transactions linked to your family accounts, I flagged a pattern of outgoing transfers from your son's personal investment portfolio, the one held at this institution. Small amounts sent at irregular intervals to an external account. The pattern is specifically structured to stay below our automated alert thresholds. We call it structuring. How much in total? Claiborne asked. $43,200, Denise said. Moved over approximately 6 months beginning in July of last year. A pause. The receiving account is held at a separate institution under the sole name of Vanessa Greer. It was not disclosed in the sworn financial declaration signed on January 8th. The words came down in that office like something dropped from a considerable height. I pressed my back against the chair and breathed steadily. She was stealing from him, I said. My voice came out very flat. While the two of them were scheming to strip everything from me, she was taking from her own husband. The evidence indicates that yes, Denise said carefully. Claiborne leaned in toward the phone. Denise, were you able to determine what those funds were used for? Most of it went toward living expenses, groceries, fuel, clothing, purchases at stores you wouldn't associate with someone claiming financial hardship. A brief pause, and then her tone shifted, acquiring the precision of someone reading directly from notes. But $400 of it was applied as a deposit and first month's rent on a residential lease. The lease start date is January 15th. The property is a one-bedroom apartment. Claiborne picked up his pen and wrote something on the legal pad. He turned it so I could read it. She's leaving. My jaw tightened until I felt the pressure all the way up into my temples. Denise, I said, can you forward that lease address over to Claiborne's office? It's already there, she said. Pulled it straight from the billing records attached to the account. Mr. Greer, that account on its own represents a clear breach of the sworn declaration. Both your son and his wife put their signatures to under oath. Stacked on top of the mail interception charges, I'd say you're sitting on grounds for a very substantial legal claim. Much appreciated, Denise, Claiborne said. We'll follow up. He ended the call. His pen went down on the desk. He fixed his eyes on me from across that desk, wearing the expression I'd learned to read, the one that surfaced when a matter had crossed into territory from which there was no backing out. Composed, deliberate, bearing the full gravity of what lay ahead, without a single crack showing in how he held himself. She put her name on that declaration, I said, turning it over slowly out loud, knowing all the while that she was sitting on $43,000 in an account no one was supposed to find. She sat across from me and signed it. That's right, Claiborne said. And the whole time, she's been funneling Colin's own money into an escape hatch she built for herself. The picture was crystallizing in my mind the way a structural failure always does in hindsight. Once every weak point is visible, the collapse becomes inevitable and obvious. He's under the impression they're in this as one. He hasn't got the first clue that she's already arranged to walk out and leave him buried. Claiborne gave a single nod. He swung the legal pad back around and wrote down the address Denise had sent, drawing 2 circles around it. 40 minutes from their house in a building I've never dealt with. He pressed his finger to the circled address. I think we need to lay eyes on it. I studied that address sitting on the page. A feeling passed through me, cold and bone-tired. Not grief exactly, not rage, but the deep-settled weariness that comes from watching something give way inch by inch over a long time and finally spotting the fracture that tells you it's done. Then let's go, I said. I need to see this myself. Following people has never been my way. 31 years. Walking job sites trained me to trust only what I could put a number on, write down and verify load tolerances, material grades, documented findings. A hunch wasn't worth anything unless the evidence stood behind it. So, when Claiborne proposed we make the drive on Tuesday evening, I reframed it for myself. We were going to confirm what the records already suggested. That was the whole of it. Claiborne was at my door at 6:30. January had settled over the city by then, that specific winter dark that falls early and falls complete, the kind where every glowing window reads like something marooned in the black. The ride out passed mostly in silence between us, which suited Claiborne's nature. He had always been the sort of man who didn't feel compelled to fill a quiet car with noise. The building was a 4-story residential block on Crestline Avenue, planted in one of those neighborhoods poised between two versions of itself. A polished new cafe on one corner, plywood over the windows of an old laundromat on the next. Unremarkable enough, anonymous enough. The kind of address a person could sink into without drawing a glance from anyone. Claiborne pulled over on the far side of the street, a building's width down from the entrance. The cold had teeth, and our exhaled breath kept filming the windshield until Claiborne cracked his window to let in a sliver of air. "3rd floor," he said, voice low. His phone opened to the address. "Unit 3F. Lease shows the tenant as Vanessa Greer." I looked up. The windows of 3F were lit that warm amber glow that pushes through thin curtains, and I could make out silhouettes shifting behind the fabric, the restless movement of people occupying a room. We sat there for 20 minutes. Claiborne worked through a thermos of coffee he'd brought along without a word about it. I studied the building the way I used to stand before a structure, under review, patient methodical searching for whatever detail was sitting wrong. The answer to the question I hadn't yet thought to ask. The front door opened at 6:54. Vanessa came through it first. She had on the long charcoal coat, the expensive one, the one she had told Colin costs half what it actually did, the same one I'd seen her wearing at Colin's office Christmas party 2 years ago. She was laughing head angled back, her whole bearing lit up with the unmistakable ease of someone who has just set down a burden they'd been carrying for a long time. The man who followed her out was not Colin, younger, late 30s, maybe 40. Tall, dark jacket, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who hadn't spent months with the walls closing in around him. His hand found the small of Vanessa's back as they stepped toward the street, and she shifted into it without thinking the way bodies move toward what they already know well. Claiborne lifted his phone and captured 3 photographs. Fast, no sound, the screen dialed down to near dark. I tracked them to the corner, watched them turn right, and then they were gone. I sat with my hands resting in my lap. There was a hollowness in my chest, not the sharp kind, but the complete kind, like when you work a splinter free and what it leaves isn't pain, but just the absence of pressure that had been there so long you'd stopped noticing it. "How far back does this go?" I asked. "The lease itself starts January 15th, Claiborne said, sliding his phone into his pocket. "But the account feeding it runs back 6 months. The way I read it, she started laying the groundwork in July, right around when the money began disappearing from Colin's account." He wrapped both hands around the thermos. "She wasn't ever trying to save the house, Arthur. That fight was a clock she was running out." My thoughts went to Colin, to how he'd looked sitting across from me in that apartment 8 days back, worn through shoulders in a man reduced to the essentials, thanking me the way someone does when they've got nothing left to offer but the words. He'd put his name on that declaration, certain they were pulling in the same direction. He'd believed they shared the same enemy and the same stakes. He had no way of knowing that the woman beside him had already made her decision and was simply letting time run its course. "Is he aware?" I asked. "From everything in front of us?" Claiborne said, settling the thermos back in the holder. "No, I'd be surprised if he had any idea at all." My gaze stayed on the empty corner, where Vanessa and the man had turned out of sight. There was something moving through me that resisted being named. It ran too deep for one word, too knotted up with the whole weight of the past 18 days, to shake out into anything as clean as grief or anger, or even the bleak satisfaction of being proven right. "Claiborne," I said, "keep it from him." He turned and looked at me. "Even going into the mediation, that's when it matters most, especially then." I dropped my eyes to my hands. Colin stood in his own living room on Christmas Eve while his wife made a spectacle of me in front of 12 people. He picked his allegiance. He doesn't get the courtesy of a warning from me. The way he finds out is the way I found out about all of it, sitting in a room, no exits, no preparation, nowhere left to turn. Claiborne held my gaze for a long moment. Then came the nod, one slow considered dip of the head from a man who recognized that what I was describing wasn't vengeance. It was mathematics. "I'll put the mediation on the 20th, he said. 8 days to get every piece where it needs to be." I looked back at that third-floor window. Nothing moved behind the curtains now. Whatever was happening in that room had gone quiet. 8 days, I said. That'll do. Riding back, I drew out my notebook, a small leather-bound one I'd been keeping since December, logging every date, every name, every fragment of evidence, and at the foot of the final page of notes, I wrote 2 words. I put a line beneath them, closed the notebook, and slid it back into my coat. The words were January 20th. That night was the first since Christmas Eve that I went down and stayed down, no waking, just sleep. Brenda Cromwell had the door open before I reached it. She must have had an eye on the window, because it had swung wide while I was still climbing the porch steps, and she stood there already holding it for us. There was something in her face, that particular blend of warmth and steady seriousness that I'd come to recognize in people who grasped without needing it, explained the weight of what they were being asked to do. "Mr. Greer," she said, offering her hand. The handshake was firm and dry. "Come in, the both of you." Brenda was somewhere in her mid-60s, silver haircut, close posture, so upright it looked like something she'd earned over decades of not backing down. The house was orderly and clearly lived in photographs of family along the walls, a row of paperback novels on a shelf above the fireplace, the sort of home that lets you know exactly the kind of person who lives there without making any bid to impress. She walked Claiborne and me through to the dining room table, where a laptop sat open and a USB drive was waiting beside it on a square of folded paper. "I've gone through every bit of it," she said, drawing out a chair and settling in across from us. "All the footage from the 24th, timestamps marked. I want to walk you through exactly what I found." She plugged the drive in and angled the laptop so we could both see. The picture was sharper than I'd been expecting. Brenda's camera was fixed to the corner of her porch eave, angled to take in the full width of the street and the fronts of the houses opposite. The timestamp in the lower right read, December 24th, 2002, 20:47, 20 minutes before 8 in the evening. The frame showed the front window of Colin's living room, lit and curtained, the Christmas tree's glow bleeding through the fabric. Then, as the angle picked up the side window, the one that opened onto the shared space between the living room and kitchen, something moved, a figure, me carrying the mop bucket. "This is where it begins," Brenda said quietly, leaning in and pressing play. I watched myself on the screen, 71 years old, moving with care under the weight of the bucket crossing the room. Then the foot entering from the left of frame, deliberate heel first, planted squarely across my path. The fall came fast, water across the floor, and then Vanessa stepped into frame. Even through the soft blur of an outdoor camera, working at distance, the sequence was not open to interpretation. She had been positioned for it. The placement of her foot, the timing, the instant she straightened and reached for the mop handle, none of that was reflex. It was choreography. The audio was incomplete. The camera's microphone was built for outdoor range, not interior acoustics, but through the muffled distance a voice pushed through. Vanessa's voice raised and hard. Fragments, "You did that on purpose. Kneel down. In this house I am the one." Pieces, but enough. I heard it clearly from my porch. Brenda said, her voice steady, though her eyes burned with a fury she was barely keeping in check. "I was outside gathering my holiday lights. I heard the shouting and went to look. I've wished ever since that I'd done more that night." Her jaw went tight. "I should have crossed that street." "You're doing something now," Claiborne said. "That matters." Brenda nodded. She reached for the folded sheet of paper beside the drive. "I've already put together a witness statement. Everything I observed, the exact times, and what I heard from where I was standing. My neighbor from across the alley, her name is Harriet. She was also outside that night. She's prepared to corroborate the audio she heard." Brenda pushed the statement across the table. "I had it notarized yesterday morning." Claiborne picked it up and read it, the way he read everything unhurried, not performing attention, just genuinely absorbing each word. When he set it down, the look he gave Brenda carried something close to respect. "This is exactly what we needed," he said. "Good." Brenda folded her hands on the table, and something in her expression shifted the composed exterior, giving way briefly to something more personal. She looked at me directly. "Mr. Greer, Ted told me years ago that you made calls you had no obligation to make, that you gave time you didn't have to give to a problem that wasn't yours for a man you barely knew." Her voice softened at the edges. "I never forgot that. And when I came to understand what was happening in that house across the street, I thought, now I get to give it back." Something tightened in my throat. I laid my hand over hers on the table for a moment. There wasn't a word that would have fit the occasion, so I didn't go searching for one. That afternoon, Claiborne and I brought the footage to a digital forensic specialist he had used on 2 prior cases, a methodical, precise man in his 40s who ran his analysis without commentary and delivered his conclusions in the same flat tone he might use to read back a weather report. He sat across from us in a spare, well-lit office with 3 monitors and equipment whose names I didn't know, and walked through his findings point by point. The video submitted as evidence in the conservatorship petition, he said, pulling up a side-by-side comparison on the center screen, has been compiled from a minimum of 7 separate source recordings. The metadata embedded in each shows different creation timestamps, spanning from May through November of last year. He directed our attention to a row of highlighted entries on the left screen. Additionally, the ambient lighting in clips 1, 3, and 5 is inconsistent with December morning light. And he clicked to a close-up image. The embroidered date markers on the subject's shirt cuffs confirm distinct garments across different clips, each corresponding to a different month of first use. Claiborne leaned toward me. "The shirts," he murmured. 7 source recordings, I said. 7 separate mornings pulled out of context and stitched together to construct a story that never happened. The specialist gave a single nod, his expression unchanged. "A full written report with supporting analysis will be ready by end of business tomorrow. It will satisfy the evidentiary standards for court admission under the federal rules of evidence." Claiborne thanked him, gathered the preliminary notes, and walked with me back out to the car in the cold January air. He carried his briefcase in one hand and wore what I had come to recognize as his thinking expression, that focused inward look he got when he was arranging facts into order. Back at his office, he laid 5 color-coded folders across the desk in a row. 5 categories. He said, touching each one in turn. Brenda's footage and witness statement. The mail interception records from Denise. Jeffrey Ashton's recording and sworn statement. The digital forensics report on the fabricated video. And his hand came to rest on the 4th folder, the financial declaration, the account records, and the documentation of what that money had actually been used to fund. He looked at me. 22 individual items across 5 categories of wrongdoing. Everyone independently verifiable. Everyone documented, authenticated, and ready. I looked at those 5 folders lined up across his desk. 22 items. 22 fractures in a structure that had been passing itself off as solid for years. "I think we're ready," I said. Claiborne nodded. Then he picked up the 4th folder, held it for a moment, and set it back down. "Mr. Greer," he said, choosing his words carefully. "When I open that folder in that room on Monday, when Colin sees what's inside, I want you prepared for something I've encountered before in cases like this. The person hurt most by the truth isn't always the one who committed the act. Sometimes it's the one who never knew." He met my eyes. "Are you ready for that?" I thought about Colin, about who he had been and who he had become, about the distance between those 2 versions of him and whose choices had carved it out. "I've been ready since the night Dolores died," I said. The mediation room occupied the 3rd floor of a legal services building at Civic Center Plaza. A rectangular space-long mahogany table, 8 leather chairs, windows looking out over the parking structure next door. Neutral by design. The kind of room built to make every party feel equally off balance, which I had always suspected was precisely the point. I arrived at 9:30. Claiborne was already there, briefcase open on the table, the 5 folders arranged before him in the same sequence he had laid them out in his office 5 days earlier. A recording device sat at the center of the table, standard procedure for formal mediation, with both parties' consent. The mediator, a composed woman in her late 50s named Ms. Waverly, introduced herself and walked through the ground rules in the measured tone of someone who had presided over a great many rooms full of people intent on wounding each other and had learned to keep things moving regardless. I sat on the left side of the table, Claiborne beside me. I had worn my good suit, the charcoal one I'd bought for Dolores's funeral, and worn only twice since. It felt right. This was in its own way also a burial. Colin and Vanessa arrived at 10:03 together, which I noted. Vanessa came through the door, first chin up, her expression arranged into something designed to project confidence that landed instead as effort. She had dressed with care-structured blazer hair, pinned back, the deliberate presentation of a woman who needed to be taken seriously. Colin followed in a dark sport coat, and for a moment, as he came through the door and his eyes found mine across the room, something passed across his face that I couldn't fully read. Their new attorney, a younger man I didn't recognize, carrying a leather portfolio, he hadn't had long enough to break in, settled beside them, and immediately began reviewing documents he should have gone through 3 days ago. "Good morning," Ms. Waverly said, looking around the table. "We're here today to address the outstanding financial dispute between Arthur Greer and Colin and Vanessa Greer, including matters related to a promissory note, a property title freeze, and associated contractual obligations. Before we move to substantive discussion, I want to confirm that all parties have consented to recording." She looked toward Colin's attorney, who nodded without lifting his eyes from his portfolio. "Good. Mr. Claiborne, as the initiating party, would you like to begin?" "Thank you, Ms. Waverly." Claiborne straightened his already straight jacket and looked across the table at Colin and Vanessa with the unhurried calm of a man who had been waiting a long time for this moment and had decided to take it at exactly the right pace. "Before we turn to any financial matters, I'd like to lay out some contextual information I believe is essential to understanding the full nature of this dispute." Vanessa shifted in her chair. Her attorney looked up. Colin's hands rested flat on the table in front of him. Claiborne opened folder number 1. On the evening of December 24th, 2002, he said, "My client was directed by Vanessa Greer to mop the floors of the family home during a dinner party attended by 12 guests. While carrying the equipment back to storage, he fell. The petitioner in the conservatorship filing characterized this incident as evidence of violent and erratic behavior." Claiborne reached into the folder and produced a laptop, which he opened and turned to face the room. "This is security footage from a camera belonging to a neighbor, Brenda Cromwell, whose property directly faces the Greer residence. The footage was captured in real time on the evening in question. Ms. Cromwell has provided a notarized witness statement and is available to testify." He pressed play. The room watched the screen. I watched the room. Vanessa's expression didn't change at first. She was composed. She had practice at it. She had been managing services for years. But I saw the moment she recognized what she was watching, because her right hand, which had been resting on the table, slid down to her lap, a small, involuntary retreat. Colin leaned forward. His eyes were locked on the screen. I watched him watch his wife extend her foot. I watched him watch the fall. I watched him watch himself standing in the doorway. And I watched the color leave his face the way color drains from a room when every light cuts out at once with nothing to fill the dark. When the audio fragments came through Vanessa's voice, "You did that on purpose." Colin's jaw tightened, but no sound came out. Claiborne closed the laptop. I'd also like to draw the room's attention to a statement made by Vanessa Greer on the evening of December 24th, which was partially captured by the external microphone of Ms. Cromwell's camera and witnessed in full by Ms. Cromwell from her porch. He looked directly at Vanessa. Specifically, the statement, "Let him fall. And if he can't get up, that's one less problem for us." "Would you like to contest that characterization, Mrs. Greer?" Vanessa's chin lifted a fraction of an inch. "That's been taken out of context." "We have the witness," Claiborne said pleasantly. "We can establish context." Her attorney placed a hand on her arm. She pressed her lips together and offered nothing more. Claiborne reached for folder number 2. He removed a single document, the land sale contract, clean, and signed and placed it face up at the center of the table. On December 21st, 2002, he said, "Arthur Greer signed a contract for the sale of a 6-acre property on the north side of the city. The sale price was $7,400. The wire transfer from the purchasing developer cleared at 9:47 a.m. on December 24th. He let the silence hold for exactly 3 seconds. The Christmas dinner, at which my client was made to kneel on the floor of his son's home, began at approximately 7:00 p.m. that same evening. By that point, $7.4 million had been sitting in Arthur Greer's private account for over 11 hours. The room absorbed that. Colin picked up the contract with both hands. I watched his eyes travel down the page to the date. I watched them stop. I watched them go back to the top and read it a second time, as though a second pass might change what the first had shown him. His hands were shaking not violently, but with the fine involuntary tremor of someone whose body has grasped something before the mind has caught up. The contract quivered between his fingers like a page in a draft. He looked up at me. Across the full length of that mahogany table past the mediator, the attorneys, the recording device, my son looked at his father for the first time. Not with the bored contempt of Christmas Eve, not with the calculated desperation of the apartment visit, but with something raw and exposed and terrible. "You knew," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. It wasn't an accusation. It was the sound of a man standing at the rim of something with no visible bottom. I held his gaze and said nothing, because Claiborne was already reaching for folder number 3, and what was inside it would hurt Colin in ways that had nothing to do with money, and I had made myself a promise a long time ago that, when this moment arrived, I would not look away. Claiborne set the 3rd folder on the table without a word. The room had gone so quiet after Colin's question that I became aware of the ventilation running in the ceiling, a low, steady hum that had been there since we walked in, and that I was only now hearing. Vanessa had straightened in her chair. Her attorney held his pen above his notepad, but wasn't writing anything. Claiborne opened the folder. He removed a single document, the insurance account records Denise had pulled, with the authorization line, the withdrawal date, and the dollar amount printed in the clean, impersonal typeface of institutional paperwork. He placed it face up at the center of the table. In the spring of 3 years ago, Claiborne said, his voice carrying the measured gravity of a man who knew precisely what he was about to do and had made his choice to do it. Dolores Greer was diagnosed with a treatable form of cancer. Her oncologist developed a treatment protocol. The projected cost was covered in full by a health benefit fund she had maintained for 22 years. He paused. 3 months before her scheduled treatment was to begin, the entirety of that fund, $67,000, was withdrawn. The authorization was signed by Colin Greer, her son acting under a healthcare proxy she had granted him. Colin's new attorney looked up sharply. His pen dropped to the notepad. The funds were transferred to a private real estate investment account. Claiborne continued, also held in Colin Greer's name. That investment failed entirely 4 months later. Dolores Greer's treatment was canceled when the billing department discovered no funds remained in the insurance account. She was told the policy had lapsed. He looked at Colin directly. She died believing the system had failed her. She never knew her son had taken the money. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Colin made a sound I had never heard from him before, not in 43 years of being his father. It came from somewhere beneath language, beneath dignity, beneath everything he had constructed himself to be. He pushed back from the table, both palms pressed flat against it, and his whole body folded forward as if something load-bearing inside him had finally given out. His shoulders heaved. He pressed his fists against his mouth, and the sob that came through anyway was ragged and broken and awful. "That's not... I was going to pay it back." His voice came apart on the last word. "I was going to put it back before she needed it. I swear to God the investment was supposed to... Colin." Claiborne's voice was not unkind, but it was immovable. The treatment window closed. There was no putting it back. Colin's attorney reached for his arm. Colin pulled away. He was crying openly now, his face contorted with a grief that had no adequate place to land the grief of a man who had been carrying the full weight of what he'd done, without allowing himself to feel it completely, and was now feeling all of it at once in a room full of witnesses, with no more room to run. Vanessa had not moved. She sat watching her husband fall apart across the table, with an expression that was not compassion and was not guilt. It was calculation. She was assessing. I had known since the night of January 12th, what was in folder number 4. I had known it was coming. But watching Claiborne open it and spread the contents across the table, the bank statements, the lease agreement, the photographs Claiborne had taken from the car on Crestline Avenue, I felt something in my own chest I hadn't anticipated. Not satisfaction, something closer to sorrow, the particular sorrow of watching an inevitable thing finally land. "Mrs. Greer," Claiborne said, "I'd like to direct your attention to these documents." Vanessa looked at the photographs first. Something moved through her face fast and complicated, a flicker of recognition, a flash of calculation, and then a careful resettling into something neutral. But her hands folded on the table in front of her, tightened until the knuckles went white. "That is a photograph taken on the evening of January 12th. Claiborne said, showing you leaving the building at this address." He tapped the lease agreement. "In the company of a man who is not your husband. The lease on this property, a 1-bedroom apartment, begins January 15th. The deposit and first 6 months' rent were drawn from funds moved out of Colin Greer's personal investment account, without his knowledge or consent. The total transferred over those 6 months was $43,200. Colin had stopped crying. He was staring at the photograph. The color that had left his face during the insurance revelation hadn't returned, but something new had taken its place, a slow dawning horror that was different from grief. More animal, more immediate. Vanessa? His voice had dropped to almost nothing. What is that? Colin, I can explain. What is that? The words came out louder this time, cracking at the edges. Vanessa's attorney put his hand on her arm and said something low and urgent that didn't carry across the table. She shook him off. She looked at Colin, and for just a moment, the whole performance fell away. And what sat underneath it was not remorse and was not love. It was the cold, practical expression of a woman caught before she'd planned to be recalculating her position in real time. Colin saw it. Whatever he read in her face in that moment was enough. He came out of his chair faster than I expected. Faster than anyone in the room had anticipated, driving toward the corner of the table where Vanessa sat. The building's security officer, who had been posted near the door, crossed the room in 4 strides and had both arms around Colin before he reached her. Colin struggled, his face wet and contorted, shouting something I couldn't distinguish over the sudden scrape of chairs and Ms. Waverly on her feet calling for order. Vanessa had pressed herself back hard against her chair. Both hands raised, her expression finally showing something that looked like genuine fear. It took 90 seconds to bring the room back. Colin's attorney walked him out into the hallway. Claiborne and I remained at the table. Ms. Waverly straightened her jacket and breathed out slowly. Vanessa sat very still, hands back in her lap, eyes fixed on the wall to her left. When Colin came back in, he was hollowed out, the rage spent, the grief gone, everything gone. He sat down and looked at no one. Claiborne set the final document on the table, the sworn financial declaration signed January 8th, notarized by Roslyn. Beside it, the bank statement showing Vanessa's undisclosed account. On January 8th, Claiborne said, "You both signed this declaration under oath, certifying that no assets or accounts were being withheld. This account," he pointed to the statement, "was not disclosed. Under federal law, a false sworn declaration constitutes perjury. Under the terms of the promissory note signed on the same date, this violation triggers the immediate acceleration of the full loan balance." He looked at both of them across the table. "You now owe my client the full principal due immediately, and both of you are subject to federal perjury charges." Colin's attorney leaned close and said something quiet. Colin nodded once mechanically, the nod of a man who has stopped processing and is simply letting his body move through the motions. I looked at my son one last time across that table. "I gave you a chance, Colin," I said. My voice was steady. "On Christmas Eve, when I was on my knees, that was your last chance. You made your choice." He didn't answer. He was looking at the surface of the table in front of him, and I understood that wherever he had gone inside his own head, it was a place I could no longer reach. I stood up. Claiborne gathered his folders, and I walked out of that room at 3:00 in the afternoon, leaving behind everything that needed to be left there. Nora was in the lobby when I came through the door from the stairwell. She had been there since 9:30 that morning, sitting in one of the chairs near the window with a paperback open in her lap that I was fairly certain she hadn't read a single page of. She looked up when she heard my steps, and whatever she found in my face made her close the book without marking her place. She didn't ask what had happened. She simply stood, took my arm, and walked with me to the building's front door and out into the cold January afternoon. And that was exactly right. 2 days later, Claiborne called. "The perjury charges have been filed," he said when I picked up. "Vanessa's accounts, all of them, including the one she never disclosed, have been frozen pending the federal investigation. The title transfer on the house cleared this morning." A pause. "It's yours, Arthur, legally and completely." I was standing at the window of my apartment on Founders Boulevard, looking out at the river. The January light was thin and flat, the way it goes in the final week of the month when winter stops pretending to be dramatic and settles into plain endurance. "And Collins?" I asked. Claiborne exhaled carefully. "The situation with Dolores is legally complicated. The healthcare proxy gave him legitimate authorization over her medical accounts. Using that authorization for personal financial gain is deeply wrong. But prosecuting it criminally requires establishing intent beyond reasonable doubt, which is difficult when the proxy itself was valid. The district attorney's office is reviewing it, and they are also pursuing elder financial abuse charges under California statute, which carries its own criminal penalties. That process is ongoing. A pause. What is not complicated is the civil picture. He's lost the house. When his debts are netted against his assets, he's significantly underwater. His employer in the furniture industry was made aware of the conservatorship filing and the fraud allegations he's been placed on indefinite leave. Claiborne's voice was quiet, not triumphant. He's going to be paying off what Vanessa left him with for a very long time. I pressed 2 fingers to the cold glass of the window. Is he all right physically? As far as I know, yes. That was all I needed. I didn't ask for more. Stuart, I said, I want to move forward with the property conversion today if we can. That afternoon, Claiborne met me on the sidewalk in front of the house on Ridgemont Drive, the 4-bedroom colonial in the gated community where I had lived for 2 years and 4 months as an invisible man. I stood there the way I used to stand before a building I'd been sent to assess, looking past the surface, past the landscaping and the fresh paint and the Christmas wreath someone had finally taken down to the structure underneath, asking what it might become rather than dwelling on what it had been. The conversion paperwork is ready, Claiborne said beside me, his breath misting in the cold air. Nonprofit registration, zoning variance, 501c3 application. I've been building this since November. We just needed the title to clear. What do we call it? I said, though I already knew. I had known since the night I sat at Nora's kitchen table with that insurance document in front of me and understood for the first time the full shape of what had been taken. Claiborne reached into his briefcase and produced the registration form. At the top in the field for the organization's name, he had already filled in 4 words: the Dolores Greer Center. My eyes burned. I pressed my lips together and breathed through my nose until the tightening in my chest eased enough to speak. For survivors of elder financial abuse, I said. Legal advocacy, emergency housing assistance, financial recovery services. It's everything your wife would have wanted someone to have, Claiborne said quietly. I signed the forms on the hood of his car. My hand was steady, my chest was not, but that was all right. Some things are supposed to hurt when they heal. 3 days later, I moved into the house I had bought the previous October, a small 2-bedroom on the coast, 40 minutes south of the city, with a front porch that faced the water, and a yard that needed work, and windows that caught the morning light in a way that reminded me powerfully and unexpectedly of the kitchen in the house Dolores and I had shared for 26 years before everything changed. Nora helped me carry boxes. She was cheerful and bossy about where things ought to go the way she had been since we were children, and I was grateful for every word of it. When the last box was inside, she put on coffee in my new kitchen, while I arranged the desk in the 2nd bedroom I planned to use as an office. I set Dolores's photograph on the windowsill, the same one I had carried through 2 years and 4 months in that storage room, through Nora's guest room, through the apartment on Founders Boulevard. The one from our 31st anniversary, her laughing at something I had said that I would never be able to recall. I sat in the chair at the desk and looked at her. It's done, I said, not to the room, to her. Nora appeared in the doorway with 2 mugs. She looked at the photograph, then at me, and something soft and complicated moved through her expression that she made no effort to conceal. She handed me a mug and settled on the edge of the desk. What happens now? She asked. I looked out the window at the water. The afternoon sun hung low and broad, turning the ocean's surface into something bright and restless, and entirely unmoved by the particular griefs and hard-won victories of a 71-year-old man. Oh, I said, I live. Nora raised her mug. Then let's start with this coffee. I almost smiled. And then I did a real one, the kind that catches you off guard by showing up before you've made any decision to let it. Outside, the water kept moving. The light kept shifting. And across town, in a building already being measured out for renovation, a sign was waiting to go above the door. 4 words in clean letters on a structure that had once held nothing but the record of what people are capable of doing to one another when they've stopped believing the other person is worth anything. 4 words that said someone here was loved, someone here was wronged, and someone chose not to let that be the end of it. I spent 30 years examining other people's foundations. It took me 71 years to lay my own. If there is a single thing I want you to take from what I have told you, it is this: dignity is not something another person can hand you, and it is not something anyone can strip away permanently, not unless you hand them that power yourself. What I wanted was not revenge. What I wanted was for the truth to be seen, There is a real difference between those two things. Revenge is about inflicting pain. Making the truth visible is about something else entirely, and truth does not require volume. It only requires patience. I believe that suffering is not wasted by God. What was taken from Dolores, what was taken from me, none of it went to nothing. It became a center that carries her name. It became this story. I gave away 2 years and 4 months of my life, making myself small, waiting for my son to remember what I meant to him. Don't do what I did. Don't shrink yourself down, in the hope that it will make the people around you love you more. It won't work. The people who diminish you are depending on your silence to keep doing it. Don't give them that. A man seeking justice doesn't always raise his voice. Sometimes he simply refuses to vanish. And justice doesn't always wear the shape of a courtroom. Sometimes it looks like an old man stepping out a door at 2 in the morning, pulling a worn suitcase behind him, knowing in his bones that he deserves better. If this story found you and something in it stayed with you, I'd like to hear it. Pass it along to someone who needs to hear it too. And if you believe that every person is owed basic dignity, there are more stories ahead on Grandpa's Revenge. A note for those joining us in future stories: this channel may include dramatized or fictional elements created solely to shed light on real human experiences. If that's not your preference, no hard feelings at all. But if you're still here, I think you already know why you stayed. If you've stayed with me all the way to the end of this, I want to say thank you. Truly, stories like this one don't get told often enough, and the fact that you're here means something to me. This journey cost more than I can put into a few sentences. It cost years of silence, years of making myself smaller than I was, years of hoping that patience alone would be enough to bring my son back to who he once was. What it taught me is that dignity doesn't wait for anyone's permission to return. I believe God does not waste what we suffer through, and the Dolores Greer Center standing where that house once stood is proof enough of that for me. If you take anything away from these grandpa revenge stories, let it be this. First, do not wait for the people who are hurting you to stop on their own. Document everything. Keep your records. Let the truth build itself on paper. Second, silence is not the same as peace. If you have gone quiet to keep someone comfortable, ask yourself who that quiet is really serving. Third, the people who love you don't ask you to disappear. If someone in your life only accepts you when you are diminished, that is not love, that is control. Fourth, it is never too late to build something that lasts. These father stories, the ones that end not in bitterness, but in something that carries a name worth honoring, those are the ones worth telling. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and tell me what moved you most. Share it with someone who needs to hear that they are not alone, and that the truth given enough time and enough patience has a way of standing up on its own. Subscribe to Grandpa's Revenge. There are more stories ahead. Thank you for being here. Until next time, take good care of yourself.